Rain hammered the roof in a steady fury, the storm tearing across the plains like a herd of wild horses. And inside the barn, the rancher moved quietly among his animals, lantern swinging from his hand, its glow pushing back the shadows. At 40 years, his life had been measured in seasons and solitude, his touch spent on leather reins and worn tools, never on the softness of another's hand, and he had long since accepted the silence of it. But the storm carried a sound not of thunder. It was the frantic pounding of a fist against the barn door. He froze, heart jolting as lightning split the sky, and in its flash he saw her silhouette pressed against the wood, hair plastered to her face, skirts torn by wind and water. "Please," she cried, her voice raw, nearly drowned by rain. "Let me in." He dropped the lantern hook against a beam, boots striking the dirt floor as he crossed to the door, pulling it wide. The storm surged inside, whipping water and cold air, and with it stumbled a woman, trembling, clutching her arms tight to her chest. She looked up, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "I can't make it any farther," she whispered. "Just let me sleep here. Just the barn. Until the storm breaks." He swallowed hard, words caught in a throat unused to speaking to women, and for a moment his shame burned hotter than the fire in the sky, for he had never stood so close to one. Yet he lifted his coat from its peg and draped it around her shoulders without thought, the fabric swallowing her shivers. "You'll not sleep in the hay alone," he said, his voice low, steady, though his heart thundered louder than the storm. "There's room by the stove." Elias Redfeather's voice threaded through the moment like a quiet echo. Sometimes the loneliest men do not seek the storm, but it comes to them all the same, carrying the one soul who will change the silence forever. She stared at him, lips parted as though unsure whether to trust, then nodded faintly, clutching his coat tight as if it were her only anchor. Lightning flashed again, and in its glow he saw what he had never dared imagine. That fate might have chosen his solitude's end on the very night he believed it would last forever. Her hands shook so violently that the tin cup rattled when he filled it with water, and she gripped it tight, holding it close as though afraid the storm itself might tear it away. She sat on the low bench near the stove, its heat chasing the chill from her soaked dress, while he busied himself with small, awkward motions, stacking wood that did not need stacking, adjusting the lantern's flame, though it burned steady. At 40, he had never shared the quiet with a woman, and the weight of her presence filled the barn heavier than thunder. "You can rest here," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse, and he kept his eyes on the floor as if the dirt could steady him. She swallowed, her lips trembling. "I won't be trouble. At first light I'll be gone." The words struck his chest with an ache he had no name for, a sudden fear that this warmth would vanish as quickly as it had come. He turned, meeting her gaze for the first time, and in the glow of the stove he saw not weakness, but a fierce weariness, the look of someone who had fought too long against the world. "Storm won't break by morning," he said, softer now. "And I've got more than enough room." Elias Redfeather's voice carried over the crack of firewood like an old truth. It is a strange thing when two lonely souls collide, stranger still when each sees their own ache mirrored in the other's eyes. She drew his coat tighter around herself, her shoulders slumping as the weight of exhaustion overtook her, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean back against the wall, her guard slipping. "I didn't mean to end up here," she murmured, almost to herself. I couldn't stay where I was." He said nothing, for questions pressed hard against his tongue, but shame held them back. And instead he stirred the embers, sparks leaping as though the fire could ask for him. She closed her eyes, the lines of strain softening, and in that silence he felt the storm outside pound less fiercely, though he knew it still raged. He lowered himself to the opposite bench, careful to keep a respectful distance, yet his chest burned with the knowledge that for the first time in 40 years, the quiet was no longer empty. It was shared, fragile and alive. Lightning cracked so close it shook the ground beneath the barn, and the horses reared against their stalls, hooves pounding like drums as thunder rolled over the valley. He leapt to his feet, the bench tipping against the wall, and hurried toward the restless animals, his voice low but steady. "Easy now, easy," he murmured, running his hand along a quivering flank. She startled upright, clutching the coat close, fear flickering across her face as the lantern swung wildly on its hook. Another strike lit the rafters white, and a loose board rattled, rain pushing through the crack in a sudden spray. Without thought, she rushed to his side, her skirts dragging damp across the dirt floor, and laid her hand on the neck of a trembling mare. The animal snorted, stamping once, but calmed beneath her touch, as though sensing the same storm-beaten spirit in her as in itself. He glanced at her, surprise sparking in his eyes, and for a heartbeat the chaos of thunder fell away, leaving only the sight of her hair plastered to her face, her breath coming quick as she soothed the frightened creature. "You've done this before," he said, voice louder than the storm for the first time. She gave a shaky laugh, brief and bitter. "Where I come from, storms were the only constant. You learn to calm what you can, even if it's not yourself." His chest tightened at her words. A recognition of loneliness carried different yet the same, and Elias Redfeather's voice drifted over the din like a thread of memory. When two wounded lives meet in the middle of fury, the storm itself becomes their witness, binding them stronger than stillness ever could. He pulled another board across the gap, hammering it fast with nails from the wall, and when he turned back, the lantern's glow caught her face, her cheeks flushed with exertion, her lips parted as though she had more to confess, but held it back. The thunder rumbled again. But the barn had steadied, the animals quieting under their combined presence, and he realized then that he had never worked beside another soul who carried the same fire to endure. She drew the coat tighter, shivering, but this time not from fear alone. And as she met his gaze, the air between them held a charge deeper than the storm outside. Something fragile yet unshakable, waiting only for words to name it. The storm still hammered the roof, but inside the barn the rhythm had steadied, the animals soft with breath and shifting hooves, and the lantern swung gently on its hook, casting gold across the rafters and drawing long shadows that made the place feel more like a sanctuary than a shelter. He settled the mare back into her stall, brushing his palm over her mane one last time before turning toward the bench, where she now sat wrapped tight in his coat, the fabric swallowing her frame. Her eyes glowed in the half-light, restless yet softened by exhaustion, and for a moment he only watched, struck by the fragile sight of someone who looked as though the storm had been chasing her long before the rain began. "You keep it warm in here," she said softly, her voice carrying a tremor that was not quite fear. "Feels safer than I expected." He lowered himself to the opposite bench, careful to leave space, though the urge to close it pressed hard against his ribs. "Barn's always been enough for me," he admitted, fingers drumming against his knee. "Never thought I'd share it with anyone." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but enough to catch the lamplight. "You've lived alone a long time, then?" He hesitated, throat thick, but there was no point in denying it. "All my life," he said, 40 years, and nothing but work and silence." Her eyes lingered on him, and he felt the weight of her gaze more keenly than the thunder outside. "Silence can be crueler than noise," she murmured, looking down at the floorboards. That's why I left. Not a storm of weather, but a storm of voices always telling me I was less, that I should bend, that I should be grateful for chains. Elias Redfeather's voice moved through the hush like smoke through rafters. There are storms made of water, and storms made of men, and often the second are the ones that drive us farthest from home. Her confession tightened something inside him, and though he wanted to reach across, to offer a hand or word, he held himself still, knowing his awkwardness would falter where her strength deserved reverence. She pulled the coat tighter, closing her eyes briefly as if afraid to say more, and when she opened them again, her gaze held his with a fierce steadiness. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," she said. The words burned, but also bound, because he realized he had carried the same truth in silence his whole life. "You're not the only one," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, and she looked up sharply, eyes glinting in the lantern glow as thunder rolled outside. He swallowed hard, fingers curling tight on his knee, shame burning hotter than the stove. 40 years, and I've never touched a woman's hand in more than a greeting. Never kissed, never anything. His voice trailed, and the weight of his admission filled the barn like smoke, suffocating and raw. She stared at him, not with the laughter he half feared, but with a stillness that unsettled more than mockery could have. 40 years? She whispered, almost to herself, as though measuring the ache in his words against the silence of her own past. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze, heat rising in his neck. Work kept me, then the town's jokes. After a while, I figured maybe it was never meant for me. He drew a ragged breath, chest tight, certain he had spoken too much. But her hand shifted beneath the coat, small and trembling, and she laid it against the bench between them, the gesture simple yet enough to shatter his shame. "You think that makes you less?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried no pity, only something like recognition. "Because I've been touched plenty. And none of it meant what your silence has meant tonight." Elias Redfeather's voice wove gently through the hush, like wind threading through pine. "It is not the number of touches that gives them worth, but the moment one becomes truth enough to heal both souls at once." His eyes snapped to hers, startled by the raw honesty, and for the first time he saw not just weariness but fire, the courage of a woman who had survived chains yet still chose to speak of worth. "I've been running from men who knew only how to take," she whispered, clutching his coat closer. "If you've never taken, maybe that makes you the only one who could ever give." The words pierced deeper than any blade, and for the first time in his 40 years, he felt the crushing silence inside him shift, cracking like the storm breaking open above the roof. His hand hovered over hers, not daring to close the distance, yet trembling with the need to. And in the flicker of the lantern, with rain pounding fierce against the world outside, it seemed as though the choice was no longer his alone, but theirs, fragile and waiting. A blinding crack split the night as lightning struck so close it shook the earth beneath them, and before he could rise, the sound of tearing wood ripped through the barn, one of the roof planks splintering under the storm's fury. Rain poured through the gap, drenching hay and spilling onto the floor, sending the horses into a frenzy once more. He leapt to his feet, grabbing the lantern from its hook, and shouted over the roar of wind, "Hold them steady!" She didn't hesitate, the coat dragging around her as she rushed to the nearest stall, pressing her hands to the trembling flank of a gelding. The animal's eyes rolled white, but her voice, low and soothing, broke through the panic like a thread of calm. He hauled a board from the corner, nails clamped in his teeth, hammer clutched in one hand, and scrambled up the ladder into the rafters, water slashing across his face. The lantern's glow wavered below, casting her figure in golden light as she moved from horse to horse, fearless in her focus, though her body shook with cold. Elias Redfeather's voice rolled low through the storm like distant thunder. Love often begins not in tender stillness, but in the fire of survival, when two souls find their rhythm side by side against the world's fury. He braced the board across the breach, muscles straining as he drove nails through wood slick with rain, each strike a prayer that the roof would hold. Below, her voice rose again, speaking not to him but to the horses, yet he felt it steady him all the same. Easy, it's only thunder. Easy, the night will pass. The words pierced through the storm, and for the first time he realized she was speaking as much to herself as to them. When the last nail rang true, he dropped back down, chest heaving, soaked through and met her gaze across the stalls. Her hair clung to her face, eyes fierce with the wild light of one who had fought back and refused to bow. He crossed to her. The storm still pounding, but the roof sealed, and for a breath neither moved, only the sound of their ragged breathing filling the space. Then she laughed, soft, broken, but real, and the sound struck him harder than any thunder. His heart lurched, for it was the first time in 40 years that laughter in a storm had not come at his expense, but as a gift, shared in defiance of fear. Her laughter faded into silence, leaving only the soft hiss of rain against the patched roof and the steady breath of calmed horses. And as she sank back onto the bench, the coat wrapped close, her eyes lingered on him with a weight that pressed deeper than the storm ever could. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling, though it carried through the hush with the force of thunder. "Why did you never let yourself love before?" The question struck him raw, his chest tightening as if she had driven a nail into the very walls of his solitude, and he lowered himself slowly across from her. The lantern light catching every line carved into his face by years of work and silence. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then finally forced the words out, rough as gravel. "Because I never believed anyone would want what I had to give." He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, ashamed by the truth, yet too weary to hide it. The land, the animals, the quiet, that's all my life was. And when the jokes started, when the whispers called me less than a man, I thought maybe they were right. She leaned forward, her gaze burning in the golden light, and whispered, "And yet you gave me your coat without asking my name." The words pierced him, simple but truer than anything he could remember hearing, and Elias Redfeather's voice threaded through the moment like a prayer whispered into dying embers. Sometimes love begins not with the grand vow, but with the smallest gesture that proves a soul is not alone in the world. He stared at her hand where it gripped the coat, and before he could stop himself, he spoke the fear that had gnawed him for decades. "What if I've waited too long? What if I don't know how?" Her lips trembled, but not with fear. This time with something softer, more dangerous. "Then we'll learn together," she said, her voice breaking on the edge of hope. His breath caught, the storm outside forgotten, and though he did not move closer, the space between them felt charged, alive, as if the storm itself had shifted into their chests, waiting for the moment one of them dared to close the distance. The storm's fury ebbed with the night, leaving only the steady patter of rain dripping from the eaves and the distant roll of thunder fading into the hills, and through a crack in the barn door, the first gray light of dawn crept across the dirt floor. The lantern still glowed faintly, its flame small but unyielding, casting the two of them in a soft circle of warmth against the lingering chill. She sat wrapped in his coat, her hair tangled from the night, but her eyes awake, alive in a way they had not been when she first stumbled into the barn. He stood by the stall, leaning one arm across the beam, staring at the faint light seeping in. His chest tight with a confusion he could no longer name. Silence hung heavy, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was a hush that hummed with what had passed between them, words and confessions neither could take back. She broke it first, her voice soft, as if speaking might break the fragile dawn. "I thought storms only destroyed," she said, "but this one gave me a place to rest." He turned, his gaze catching hers, and though no words rose easily to his lips, the ache in his chest told him she had given him the same. Elias Redfeather's voice slipped gently through the quiet like smoke curling into sky. When the storm breaks, it leaves behind not ruin alone, but the chance for soil to grow what was never possible before. She shifted on the bench, drawing the coat closer as if to hide a shiver, and whispered, "When I leave, I'll carry this night with me." The words pierced him sharper than any blade, and before he could stop himself, he crossed the space, kneeling slightly so his eyes met hers in the lantern glow. "You don't have to leave," he said, the words escaping raw, unguarded. Her lips parted, trembling with disbelief. "You'd keep me here, after what I've brought to your door?" He shook his head, voice rough. "Not keep, just let you stay. If you choose it." The rain slowed to a whisper against the roof, and in that fragile stillness the distance between them felt thin as breath, a line waiting to be crossed. She held his gaze, her hand trembling as it slipped free of the coat, and for the first time she did not clutch it like a shield, but offered it as if to bridge the silence between them. "Do you feel it too?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the drip of rain from the eaves. Yet the words struck him harder than thunder, and his chest tightened as her trembling hand hovered close to his. For 40 years, no woman's touch had lingered in his grasp, but in that moment he laid his rough palm over hers, the calluses of work pressing against her skin like proof of a life spent waiting for this single breath. His throat constricted, words thick, but he forced them out. "I don't know what I feel," he admitted, voice low, "only that I've never wanted silence to end less than I do right now." Her eyes softened, shimmering in the faint lantern light, and she leaned closer, her fingers curling against his as though testing whether he would pull away. He didn't. Instead, he held steady, his pulse racing with the terror and wonder of it all. Elias Redfeather's voice wove through the hush like a hymn across dawn. The first touch between two souls carries the weight of every storm they survived alone, and the promise that they need not weather another without each other. She exhaled shakily, relief breaking into the faintest smile. "You waited 40 years for this," she whispered, her thumb brushing his hand with a tenderness that made his head bow. "But it doesn't make you less. It makes this more." His chest burned at her words, shame loosening its claws as hope dared to root where emptiness had lived. He searched her eyes, finding not pity, but the raw reflection of his own hunger, for touch, for belonging, for something beyond solitude. His voice cracked as he asked the question that had haunted him all night. "And if I don't know how?" She shook her head, strands of damp hair slipping over her cheek, her voice breaking with softness. "Then I'll show you, the way you showed me safety tonight." The words hung between them, fragile yet unshakable. And the barn around them seemed to still, even the animals quiet in reverence of the vow, unspoken yet already binding. He leaned closer, not daring yet to cross fully, but enough that the warmth of her breath mingled with his, and the weight of 40 years lifted, leaving only the terrifying, exhilarating truth that he was not alone anymore. Her tears came quietly, not from fear or shame, but from the weight of something she had thought forever lost, and she let them fall as the first true light of dawn spilled across the barn floor, chasing the lantern's glow into pale memory. He felt the tremor in her hand, the warmth of it against his, and for the first time in his life he did not pull back from what he did not understand. He leaned into it, as if the storm itself had washed away every excuse. "You've given me more in one night than 40 years of silence ever did," he said, his voice breaking but steady enough to carry. Her lips trembled with a smile, and she shifted closer. The coat sliding from her shoulders to reveal not frailty, but a woman unbowed, her eyes fierce with the fire of someone who had endured much, and yet still chosen tenderness. Elias Redfeather's voice slipped through the hush like wind across morning grass. Love does not come measured in years, nor in the tally of touches. It comes in the instant when two broken silences find they no longer echo alone. She placed her free hand against his chest, feeling the hammer of his heart, and whispered, "Then let this storm be our beginning." He bowed his head until his forehead brushed hers, his breath uneven. The world narrowing to the fragile closeness of two souls who had lived too long apart. No vows were spoken, no crowd to bear witness, yet in that barn their bond became unshakable, sealed not by law or paper, but by the truth of need met with gentleness. Outside, the storm had left the earth washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of rain and soil, and through the open crack of the barn door, a shaft of light fell over them like a blessing. He wrapped the coat back around her shoulders, but this time it was not to hide shame. It was to mark her as his, the symbol of a night that would never fade. She closed her eyes, resting against him, and he felt the weight of 40 years fall away like broken boards under repair, leaving only the fragile, radiant truth. He had touched not just a woman's hand, but the beginning of forever. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If 40 years of silence ended in one storm for you, would you have been brave enough to let love in?